So welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. I'm Hassan Khawar. I'm the team leader for DFID funded seed program. And today I'm joined by a very esteemed panel on this webinar arranged by Consortium for Development Policy Research, CDPR. We have with us Dr. Land Pritchett, who is an associate at the Building State Capability Program at Harvard University's Center for International Development, and the RISE Research Center Director at Blavatnik School of Government, University of Oxford. Dr. Land Pritchett's book, Building State Capability, is making rounds. He has pioneered the concept of Problem Driven Iterative Adaptation. He is a non-resident fellow of the Center for Global Development, and he is a PhD in economics from MIT. We are also joined by Mr. Shakil Kader Khan, who prior to that, he was Secretary of Finance for a long time in the provincial government. He holds a postgraduate diploma in management from University of Surrey and has attended various national courses. We also have with us Ms. Sara Saeed, who is a BS21 senior officer from Pakistan Administrative Service. Currently, she is member directing staff at National School of Public Policy, but she has worked on various positions previously, including Commercial Secretary at The Hague, as Director General Benazir Income Support Program, Additional Registrar of the Supreme Court, and she has also worked with DFID as Skills Strategy Advisor for a large program. And we have Dr. Ejaz Nabi, who is the Country Director for International Growth Center and also the Chairperson for CDPR. He is a member of Prime Minister's think tank on COVID-19, but he has also been members of various advisory groups and committees, and he has been with the World Bank for 22 years and also professor of economics at Lahore University of Management Sciences. So I welcome you all. And today's topic is how to bring adaptive planning to KP is very interesting because, as I said, that problem-driven iterative adaptation approach, something that has been pioneered by Dr. Land Pritchett and his colleague Matt Andrews, is making rounds, is creating a lot of excitement in the development circles, in public sector, and the approach focuses on problems and not solutions. So this is something very interesting that we'll touch upon later as part of our conversation. But I would like to start with Dr. Ejaz Nabi, and because Dr. Saab, in his role at IGC and CDPR, have worked extensively in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. He was also involved in supporting the government in developing the growth strategy for the province. So I would request Dr. Ejaz Nabi if he can provide some broad context for the province of KP, its growth prospects, where the province is headed, to set the rest of the discussion in context. So over to you, Dr. Nabi.
Thank you, Hassan, and thank you everybody on the panel. It's fantastic that you could take the time to be part of this discussion. I'm especially grateful to Land. Land, I go back a long time, and we've stayed in touch, and I have watched with great admiration the leaps and jumps that Land has made as an economist and as contribution in his contributions to the profession. So fantastic, Land, to have you with us again today. Land, I'm going to take a couple of minutes to contextualize today's discussion, particularly in KP. My engagement with KP started in a very interesting way. It tells you something about the robustness of the Pakistan's political systems as well. I was at the time advisor to the Chief Minister of Punjab, whose brother was the Prime Minister, so very powerful duo. But KP government was with PTI, which was in opposition at that time, and now currently forms the government in both Punjab, KP, as well as the federal government. And I was witnessing the policy making process at very close quarters as advisor to the Chief Minister of Punjab. But then I also wore the hat of the IGC. So I told the chief minister that I will have to work on the smaller provinces. Since I was working pro bono for him, I said I will have to work on the smaller provinces as well. And he was very gracious. He said, fine, I perfectly understand that. So that gave me a very interesting insight into how the two provinces were approaching the issue of designing public policy interventions. In Punjab, it was highly centralized. The extremely motivated chief minister, a driven and a driving chief minister. But the tendency was exactly what you're going to discuss today, which is to go straight to solutions. You say, problem X, Y, Z, and we would have very fancy consultants with their presentations on solutions. At about the same time, the IGC research team got involved in KP. We'd done a growth strategy in KP. And following the growth strategy, there was a focus on education. So Secretary Education met the team and said, look, I travel all over the province, and I find that some schools, and all schools are getting the same facilities, the teachers are getting the same salary, but some schools I see very lively, the teachers are enthusiastic, the students are enthusiastic. And I go to other schools and they're dead. And it's not because we are paying the teachers less. Can you tell us what's going on? So he identified the problem very clearly. So the research team first dug up all the data that was available at the provincial education department. And they had done a lot of very good data collection on school infrastructure, on student-parent participation, teacher-parent participation in induction, the methods of inductions of teachers, et cetera, but that data had not been used. So the research team first did, straightforward, ordinary least squares kind of analysis, but put the data together and identified 5 or 6 key variables that they said seemed to make a difference in terms of school outcomes. Student presence in schools, so very low absenteeism. So there was evidence as to what explained that. So Secretary of Education said, fantastic. I have very limited budget. I can't address these 3 variables because they'll cost a lot of money. But there is one area that we want to revisit, which is school inspections. Can you please dig deeper into the school inspections area and tell me what's wrong with the school inspection system, which is missing out on some school performance? And that got into an RCT type intervention, a 2 years engagement, putting together a lot of information that existed in KP but was not being utilized by decision makers, etc. So an extremely productive engagement over 2 years. I won't get into the results because that will make my intervention too long. Suffice it to say that I saw a complete contrast in engagement. In Punjab, very much focused on what's the solution? And in KP, very much focused on what's the problem? And then how do I use the instruments at my disposal to find the solutions? So this is the context for you to now educate us on this new approach to policy design. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Nabi. So Lant, I'll move over to you because I have had the luxury of being your student. I'm fairly familiar with PDIA, but I think a good starting point would be if you can, for our audience, explain what PDIA is. Thank you.
So I think the easiest way and to start into what PDIA is to contrast it with, in some sense, the dominant paradigm of building state capability. And I think Dr. Nabi's kind of introduction is a perfect introduction to the 2 different approaches. And I just want to emphasize the 3 ways in which the PDIA approach is, in some sense, the diametric opposite of many of the standard approaches that one would take to build state capability. The first distinction I would make is that PDIA is fundamentally an organization by organization strategy. Fundamentally, versus the standard approach is often a government-wide approach to building state capability. We're going to change the regulation of the civil service. We're going to change the regulatory infrastructure of hiring civil servants. We're going to change some policy process that affects government-wide and improve state capability government-wide, independent of its actual organizational features, whereas PDIA is an organizational strategy. You pick a specific organization, and that organization itself needs to come to grips with how it is going to build its capability. The second, and you know, it isn't to say that the facilitating features of broad-based civil service reform or broad-based what's been called governance reform might not facilitate that organizational transformation, but PDIA assumes the relevant unit that the government that is interested in building capability with is an organization, a specific organization. Like Dr. Nabi was saying, the school department is doing what the school department is doing as a PDIA strategy, which means it could well be that part of the KP strategy for building capability has a broad-based component of governance reform and then prioritizes working with key organizations rather than trying to do it government-wide. Second is the distinction that we've called various things over the years, but is basically there's a problem-driven or purpose-driven approach to organizational improvement of capability, and there is a process compliance-driven approach. The process compliance-driven approach is often the dominant paradigm. It assumes you have this top-down civil structure. It assumes you have all of the features of what's called a Weberian bureaucracy of top-down hierarchical offices, instructions followed, and that the way in which you will ultimately improve performance of all the government-wide organizations is through stronger, tighter, compliance with regulation, versus the PDIA, which is purpose-driven. More and more, as I've, even since what we've written, which has now been 5 years ago, I'm convinced that a lot of the problem with attempting to building capability is you don't start from a sense of capability for what. If you start from process compliance mode, you start from the presumption that the problem, the purpose of the organization is well understood. The purpose of the organization is well internalized by its agents. They understand what the purpose is. The purpose of the organization is well understood by the supportive infrastructure, both governmental and social, around the organization. Whereas often process compliance is an excuse, a delay, an inability to actually articulate purpose. And without articulated purpose, I don't think organizations can get stronger. And with organizational purpose, it's only with organizational purpose that one can talk about building capability, in the sense that a lot of generic programs to build state capability assume that first you build capability, and then with the capability you built, then you solve problems. Our approach is exactly the opposite. We identify problems and then build the capability to solve the problem. And in building the capability to solve the identified problem, you build the capability of the organization. So that's the second key distinction, is by starting from a purpose or problem-driven modality, it's a completely different way into how one would build organizational capability, because you're identifying capability for what. So again, Dr. Nabi's narrative about, okay, here's what we can control. We can control school inspection. How would we build the capability of the existing school inspection to accomplish the purposes of creating revitalized, energetic, learning-focused schools? So you've already started from a purpose, rather than the typical modality of school inspection around the world, which is, on this global project we've seen, is often school inspectors as an instrument of process compliance, whether or not there's any key evidence the process compliance modality that the school inspectors bring actually are going to revitalize and improve learning at the school. The third key distinction, therefore, is in the organization-driven, purpose-driven organization approach, I think we take what I call a capability, organizational capability approach rather than a capacity building approach. Oftentimes it's assumed that's what's lacking in a low performance organization is people with the individual capacities to do the work, rather than identifying how do we hook these people together with resources, with purpose, with the, with the equipment to accomplish purpose, which is an organizational capability thing. And organizational capability may only be distantly related to individual capacity. So a lot of training-driven approaches to capability building start from an implicit presumption that the individual agents inside the organizations don't themselves have the capacity to do what they need to do, as opposed to that they're not embedded into a set of organizational processes and practices that enable their capacities. And I think in Pakistan, unleashing the capacities that now exist inside many of these organizations can lead to much more rapid improvement than, kind of standard things. The fourth thing I'll say is this approach to succeed, to be organization, purpose-driven, capability building by focusing on organizational capabilities, which are how you match agents to structures to purposes. You really have to, with the organizations that you're working with, and this is why it's an organizational approach that's probably paired with a more governmental wide approach, is you really have to provide, strangely enough, more rather than less autonomy at the local level. And this is often paradoxical because one of the appeals to a standard bureaucracy of a process compliance driven approach is that if you have these low performing schools, or you have low corrupt police, or if you have low performance in the healthcare sector, it's easy to believe that kind of beating from the top down and less autonomy, more pressure on the individual is going to be the solution. But for many of the problems Pakistan now faces, the logistical approach has played out. Whatever can be done through this purely logistically top-down process compliant rule enforcement is mostly done. And now you actually need agents in the system that are committed to purpose. And it's paradoxical that trying to push the process compliance approach, even when you have low levels of function, can be counterproductive to creating the purpose-driven agents that you need on the ground and in the field. And a metaphor, and we love metaphors in PDIA, is that you don't make Pinocchio into a real boy by adding more strings. There's a famous story of Pinocchio, and he's a puppet, and he wants to be a real boy, and you can add more strings to your local agents, and that will make them better puppets. But it won't turn them into purpose-driven agents that really drive organizational reform that can lead you to high levels of capability. And so in some ways it sounds paradoxical, but often even in conditions of low performance, you actually need to focus on how do I unleash the agents to exercise the capacities they already have embedded in an organizational capability approach that's clearly purpose-driven. So you see this strategy works from agent to organization and from organization to agent as a way of building capability, but it goes through certain steps. And I'm just trying to contrast between often the standard governance approach that's government-wide, rules-driven, process compliance enhancement, reducing the autonomy of the agents at the local level, which works for certain key logistical functions and is a part of overall capability reform, but for key functions where agents actually need to exercise discretion at the ground level to achieve purposes, it can be counterproductive. So that's a brief, I think, overview of how one would think about a strategy of PDIA as a strategy for capability building in a province like KP. Thank you.
Dr. Bridget, thank you. Very enlightening. I think all 4 points are very interesting. So PDIA as an organizational strategy. The second one is it has to be problem driven. The third one is about building the organizational capability, not the capacity. And the fourth one is around autonomy. On your last point, I think I'll take that up first, and I'll move on to Mr. Shakil Qadir Khan, who is the Additional Chief Secretary in KP. And his role is that he is a custodian of sorts of the public investment regime at the provincial level. But he has also worked as Secretary of Finance. So I think he enjoys the benefit of having a perspective both on resource allocation decisions as well as making financing available for those decisions. And Shakil Sahab, my question to you is that after 18th Amendment, provincial governments have that autonomy, I think, in a much better fashion. And federal government has diluted its role considerably. But when we look at our public investment management framework, whether it's planning, it's designing, it's monitoring, we do see that a lot of it is coming from federal government. How do you look at it? Are these the so-called proverbial strings that Land is talking about? Or is it more of a guideline? And secondly, when you look at the provincial canvas, sitting at the provincial level, do you think that the line departments and local governments have the well-needed autonomy? Or do you think that the strings that we are carrying from federal government, we are having those strings also when we go further down to the local government and line department? Over to you, Shakil sir.
Thank you very much, Hassan. Pleasure to be part of the group. The question is very broad. I'll partially agree with you and partially disagree as well. Post 18th Amendment, what we normally forget was another landmark event, and that was the 7th NFC Award, which actually promised more funds, more resources to the provinces, and it actually reversed the equation. 57.5% of the total revenue, the 4 major taxes going to the provincial governments and rest to the federal government. I believe that with that larger autonomy and more funds available to the provincial governments, the strings that you refer to got weakened, and in some cases the strings disappeared. So I don't see a lot of pressure or some sort of a force from the federal government that pushes the provincial governments towards an agenda which is perceived to be of a central nature. If you see, and if you do the analysis of the post 18th Amendment resource distribution and resource spending, I have evidence, at least in the case of province of KP, that since that the provincial government has been able to spend more on some of the key sectors like education and health. In the case of education, the investments or the allocations increased by almost 350% over the last 7 or 8 years. Similarly, health also saw about 270% jump. The third important area is police, where we again saw a lot of investment, partly because of the security situation in this area, but more importantly, because as Professor Nabi pointed out, that was one of the key area where the then government wanted to invest. Now, I'll allude to Professor Pritchett's argument of finding out the problem rather than jumping to the solution. And I think that the earlier government, the previous government, actually pointed out 3 key problems. And since that was the elected government, so I believe that they had the pulse on the public sentiment. The 3 key areas, one mentioned by Professor Nabi, education. So a lot of investment going there. The monitoring system got improved, the inspections got improved. We saw the absenteeism going down, things like that. In health, a lot of autonomy, that was one of the key areas of PDIA. That happening at least at the tertiary care level. And the third key area, the problem which was identified by the people, generally was the security situation, the police culture, the kind of problems that people faced in the criminal justice system, and a lot of investment, not only in terms of money, but also regulatory changes that resulted in a pleasant change. And right now, the police system in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa is quoted as an example, not only by the Prime Minister, but the other provinces as well. Coming over to the public investment, which is currently my primary responsibility, I actually believe that the approach of problem-driven solution would be good. But I'll be raising a couple of questions here, primarily for Professor Pritchett. We are trying actually to adopt this process without actually knowing much about this approach. This is something which is new for us. Hassan is actually the one who actually introduced us to to the concept of PDIA. But the four basic problems that I actually encounter in here is one, the organizational culture. It is pretty difficult, very difficult actually to change the organizational culture. And that's something where I'll definitely be asking Professor Pritchard if he could give us some more details as to what are the quick solutions as far as those organizational cultures are concerned. The second one would be the elected leadership, which comes with a particular mindset, and they have a few areas of their preference, even if those areas are not the actual problems that the people are facing. And I'll come back to this particular issue a little later. And the third one would be the mindset of the civil servants. Since we are also working in a very tight and a very regulated environment, and most of us have put in more than 10, 15 or 20 years of service. So changing the mindset, changing the manner in which these public servants or civil servants work, that again is an important area for us, or a challenge you could say. And the last one would be these preconceived notions that we carry, where we quickly arrive at certain solutions rather than actually looking into the whole value chain and finding out the actual problems. Now, all these things, there's this one very good example. Recently, we were doing some of our reviews, and we compared the perception surveys that we conducted in the last 6 months. And on the other hand, we saw as to what are the key areas where our elected leadership or even our departments are proposing for their future investments. And there is a huge difference between the two. The perception surveys tell us that people are actually worried about unemployment, inflation, electricity, and gas. Those are the four key pain points. Those were identified by almost every district that we surveyed. And the survey was quite large. More than 20,000 people actually participated in that survey. But when you look at the options or the choices that we get, or the priorities that we get from our departments or even the elected leadership, that primarily revolves around roads, water supply, and in some cases, schemes related to irrigation. But road sector takes the major chunk of the pie. Almost 85 to 90% of the elected leadership actually proposing different roads in the public investment area. And this is a question that I posed to the cabinet a few days back, including the chief minister. And my question was that why do we all love roads? And there were some very interesting answers. But it boils down to the fact that, as Professor Pritchard said, that unless we identify the actual problem, we won't be able to invest our monies in the right place. And right now, in the absence of that, what is happening is that the pain points are something different, but we are actually investing our major resources in a different area. So that's another challenge that we do face here. To conclude, Asan, I would say that the increase in the resources have actually helped the provincial governments. And I can sense that there is a feeling in the federal government where they feel that probably they have given too much too early to the provincial governments. But my belief is that even if there are a few hiccups, even if we have made mistakes, I think this increased autonomy, increased resources have actually helped the provincial governments. As I said, we have made mistakes. And the second step would be that if the provincial government now delegates some of its functions to the local governments, that will actually be the key change that I actually would feel or would prefer in the days to come. I stop here. Thank you.
Shigil Sahab, thank you. I think you have also kind of structured the rest of the discussion. And I think all four questions are very relevant and which we would like to touch. So your questions are how to fix the organizational culture. The second, I think you gave a very pertinent examples that we may be defining problems, but are these the problems set by political elite, or are these the problems really faced by the public? The third one is about civil servants' mindset, and the fourth one is about our own tendency to jump onto solutions. I think what you said in the end, I'm sure, and I'll go to Lant again after Ms. Hala Said, but I think what you said about mistakes is something very interesting, because PDIA, to the best of my understanding, is about creating room for positive deviance, because it is based on the assumption that we do not know all and we have to learn. But before we move on, I would like to touch upon the third point that you raised, and I would go to Ms. Sara Saeed, because she has worked in a variety of roles, but right now she's working somewhere where she comes across a number of cohorts of civil servants every year. And my question to her is in the context of recent political developments where public service, public investment has come under increased scrutiny. And when we talk about increased scrutiny, the need for transparency, there is a general tendency of the civil servants to develop a non-preference for autonomy and discretion, and they would want everything in black and white. So, and I think it also takes us back to Land's question that when we talk about organizational capability, it's not just the capacity, it's the process, it's the incentive. So, Sara, my question to you is, do you think that our current political environment support that kind of incentive structure for civil servants? Are we open for embracing more adaptive approaches? And then we can probably move on to Land on this.
I think, Hassan, when we come to complex problems such as, raising tax revenue or even, going to difficult areas and trying to create employment opportunities for people, these are problems which are not the logistical type coming from, as Dr. Pritchett says, they are complex issues, and they require some policy design space to think about the problem and to think about the different paths the organization can take. I think in the past, we've had, very straight-jacketed systems for undertaking innovation or introducing innovation in our systems. But gradually, I think there are some design features or some organizational features which I think can be adopted, and there are checks and balances there as well in the interest of the civil servant, which could lead him towards taking an innovative approach and not just be driven by preconceived notions, as Mr. Khan said. One such example is that of Punjab Skills Development Fund, which had, I think, in contrast to other donor programs that we have, where all the operational guidelines are written in stone and people can't deviate. In case of the fund, there was a board and there was a management, and the board actually was leading the policy design process based on evidence. So I think there are ways in which the civil servant's mindset or actually his fear of accountability, especially in the current political environment, can be allayed, and they can be encouraged to take steps towards innovation, because our problems are not simple, they are complex, and complexity requires that we can't just import solutions from abroad. There is limit to external validity of successful experiments abroad, and we have to look at our own context and find out solutions. So I think the way out is to look at organizational structures which provide policy design space to civil servants, and also fit in well with the bureaucratic mindset and structure.
Thank you. I think that's a very interesting point.
Hassan, before you go to Land, I just want to expand a little bit on what Sara said, because I think that'll help Land in his response. So if it's okay with you, can I add a little bit to what Sara said? Okay, so Land, we have a saying in Urdu, which is, and I will translate afterwards, it is charag tale andhera, that there is darkness under the lamp, where while it illuminates areas around it, there's darkness under it. So it's a bit of that situation. Sarah mentioned Punjab Skills Development Fund. I happen to chair the board of the Skills Development Fund, so I'm glad that it was spoken of well. And this is where, organizational changes and problem-driven approach to policy design come head to head. Because Punjab experimented with Section 42 companies. These are companies that are part of the government structure, but they're autonomous in the sense that they do not follow the usual government rules of business. They have an independent board. Hiring is done in the market. Salaries are market driven, etc. So there were a whole bunch of Section 42 companies, which is a major organizational change. That created the space for experimenting with different approaches to policy design. And the approach taken by PSDF, and you are familiar with their work because Asim Khaja and others at Harvard have been quite active. Their support was used in the rollout of policies. So new skills programs, depending on what the evidence on the ground told us. So really, it was the organizational structural change made possible by creating Section 42 companies, and then giving them the autonomy to experiment with new policy design. So the two came together, and at least in the case of Punjab's Skills Development Fund, have been very effective. All of the evaluations show that. So keep that in mind as you respond.
Thank you, Dr. Nabi. I think so. The point is very interesting that even if civil servants are not incentivized, sometimes organizational cultures or structures can be such that they can create those incentives. So I think I would like you, Lan, to comment on that. And then also to comment on what Shakeel Saab said about priorities or agendas set by the political bosses, which may or may not be problem driven, but those may not be the problems that are faced by the public. So organizational structures, and then that. Over to you.
This is clearly a case where COVID is inhibiting our optimal approach. Would be for me to come to Pakistan and spend a few days to drill into these issues. I was just in Pakistan in January and had some excellent discussions about PDIA in informal settings. But you know, the areas we're now getting to are really detailed and subtle and hard to handle, you know, in a Zoom webinar, but I'll do my best. I think and start with the elected leadership and why do we love roads? I think we want to be sympathetic that politicians naturally start from what I would call a capability first approach. What do I actually have the capability to do? And what I actually have the capability to do is often logistical tasks that don't involve organizational cultural transformation. I have an engineering department, they know how to engineer a road, they know how to build a road. Sure, there's a little slippage and contracting and whatnot, but you know, I'm very sympathetic to the elected leadership. If they come and a JAWS comes and talks about these complex transformations of the school department that may or may not lead in the long run to parents perceiving their children in better schools, or build a road that everybody can see, I can put a sign up that people see before, after there's a road. You know, I'm very sympathetic to the elected leadership saying, let me as a politician do and take credit for what I know I have the capability for doing first. And the logistical is for that reason very attractive. Whether or not it ultimately is causally well integrated with the longer term, deeper growth strategies of the type that the province really needs. So I think we need to start from where they are, which is, you know, let's take a capability approach, a capability first approach, rather than to the complex problems that people actually face. And I'm super pleased to hear that policing was key to KP's organizational efforts, because I think policing raises all of the key PDIA issues, right? You can't, and so let me start with the 4 issues that Mr. Khan, is it Mr. Khan? I'm not sure, but anyway, raised, because I think each of these is key to the actual way PDIA works in practice. And the first is organizational culture. And we have a metaphor about organizational culture, which is you can't beat a turtle to move. You know, often, particularly given the structure between elected leadership, the IAS, and kind of organization, people assume that if you have this quasi-dysfunctional, resistant organization, you can beat the turtle to move. You can pick up a stick, you can whack on the organization with kinds of external accountability structures or political pressure, and that in and of itself can cause the organization to get better. And to some extent, when you've had long-term, decades-wide organizational low levels of performance, it is because the organization has developed a hard external shell to purely external accountability reform. You know, if you beat a turtle, the turtle has a hard shell. It's going to pull in its legs, it pulls in its head, it pulls in its tail, it hunkers down, it knows whatever civil service that's reform-minded, you know, whatever Pakistan officer has been appointed is going to roll on to his next assignment in 12 or 11 months. He knows that the elected leadership, if they ignore him for long enough, they'll go build roads and do other things. And so organizational culture reform has to say, how do we get individuals and networks inside the turtle unleashed? So the question is, how do you unleash an organizational process in which the turtle sticks its head out, in which the turtle says there's elements inside the turtle, inside the organization, that see the problem similarly, that share a vision with the civil service, the leadership, about how that organization to move, and you identify and empower those people. So I think one of the things is you can't, you know, if you want an organizational culture change, it's going to have to come at least with coalitions from within. And so part of the process of PDIA is, how do we use the PDIA process to identify the change agents inside the organization and unleash them to help the organizational culture process. The second thing, and so I'm sort of going through the four things, so that's the organizational culture. I think the Pakistan civil service question is really important, and I think what's consistent with all of these different approaches we're talking to is moving from a strict account-based accountability to a strict accounting-based accountability, which is what the civil service is best at, to from accounting to account. What's an account? An account is a story, it's a narrative. It's what I tell to people whose opinion I care about why what I was doing was the right thing. And the tension is, the civil service works best on accounting-based accountability. Let's strengthen procurement processes. Let's make sure not a single dime goes missing. Let's, strengthen the top-down rules. But the strict accounting-based accountability is often at odds with an account-based accountability. Here is what needs to happen inside the school. Here's what needs to happen inside the hospital. Here's what needs to happen with the processes and practices that the everyday police agent confronts in his allocation of time and tasks. And the merging of those two things is very important. And so again, within the Pakistan civil service, you have to be able to create, how do we create an account-based accountability mentality, where I as a civil service feel myself responsible for an account of success. And that's what my job is. My job is to provide an account of success that's consistent, of course, with rule-compliant accounting. We're not saying, oh, just here's the money, do whatever you want. But you do have to think carefully, how do I encourage and enable a Pakistan civil service in which the key civil service officers see their drive as an account-based account of success to people whose opinions they value from a normative point of view. And I think within Pakistan, there is this structure of very high-performing civil servants who, if they had and were enabled with a different vision of what they could do in terms of account-based accountability, they have a lot of power and autonomy they can unleash while still providing the core infrastructure of accounting. But if, as in other reforms in other provinces, you take it top down and attempt to turn the civil servant into just a stronger and stronger conduit of top-down control, they'll go back to logistics and to control modality. And in control modality, the benefits of the provincial decentralization are lost. If a provincial decentralization just leads to another set of top-down provinces and doesn't engage the local government, doesn't engage the local people, doesn't engage the organizational frontline agents, you'll get, you know, Pakistan will have 4 top-down bureaucracies because Pakistan's a huge country. You know, the level at which local gets local is a very much smaller level than any province. I mean, obviously Punjab and Sindh, but even KP, you really need to think, as Mr. Khan was saying, of the local level. And then the last thing is that the jump to solutions, you know, is a real risk because the PDIA process is a process. And since it's a process of changing organizational culture and changing the civil service culture of how they interact with local agents, you can't, you know, oftentimes the vision sometimes is we'll use PDIA, we'll discover an innovation, and then that innovation will be implemented in a top-down way. You really, unfortunately, need to think of diffusion of success in a horizontal way, in the sense that people at each stage, in each school, in each hospital, in each police district, see that district is performing better at things that normatively matter to me. I am going to adopt the process that got them to their performance rather than I'm going to adopt the particular practice. And so the diffusion of policy often thinks we'll do this little innovation, the top will then tell everybody else to do it and they'll do it, as opposed to a diffusion process where you horizontally change organizational culture by people saying, other people similarly situated to me are having success and they are reaping the rewards of accounting for their better performance through an account of how they're doing it. And I want to join in the process of change at my, you know, in my unit. And so I think that is a really important part of avoiding the jump to solutions, because again and again, I've worked, as you might know, much more in India than in Pakistan, and they share some similar processes and structures. But again and again, we see PDIA unleashed. One, you know, district officer will adopt a thing, but then when the diffusion process is from, you know, some individual district dynamic civil service officer through the school bureaucracy, the school bureaucracy just puts the kibosh on it and it never scales. And so the question is how you replicate at the local level the conditions for process success inside the organization with the agents you have. And again, this goes back to, it's a very different mentality, but I think that mentality of diffusing the processes that led to success rather than just diffusing the particular mechanism that emerges from a few successes. And I think that is consistent with the stories that are told about policing, about schooling, about the skills fund in Pakistan. So that's how I'd address those 4 things, again, in a webinar like framework where it's hard to get down to the nitty-gritty, but I think we're headed there.
Thank you, Dr. Bridget. I think that's again very enlightening, and I think you did touch upon all 4 questions in fair bit of detail. Shakil Saab may have to ask a couple more questions, but Shakil Saab, I would want you to comment on Lance's response, and I'll also add my question to the mix. In recent days, when we talk about public investment, we talk about policy design space, and we talk about KP, we have to talk about BRT, which is the rapid transit project. And finally, it's working. And you know that people have had mixed views on that. And I think that also takes us to Lance's point of account versus accounting. Because we did feel that KP government came under a lot of questions on BRT. So I would want you to comment on what Lance said and then maybe reflect on some of the learnings, especially on this account versus accounting thing with a reference to BRT.
But sorry, can I just raise one more point that I meant to make, is that I think similar to the change in discussion about purpose-driven and account-based accountability, I want to bring into question the whole word public investment. because there's a difference between spend and actual output. And part of the whole problem is if you treat public investment as merely an accounting-based exercise of did the money get spent, that's not investment. Oftentimes the key question was the spend an actual investment? Because there's lots of ways to spend that don't actually lead, and sometimes, again, there's the story of Jack and the Beanstalk, where old folktale where the mother sends the child off with the cow to sell the cow to buy the last food that they can eat. And on his way to sell the cow, Jack discovers somebody selling him magic beans. And so he sells the last family cow for a handful of magic beans. Well, was that an investment or was that not an investment? If the beans weren't magic, it was a total waste of money. If the beans were magic, it was a massive investment. He climbs up to the giant's castle and reaps a fortune. So the question that really faces a government like Pakistan is not how much public investment, but whether the spend is investment at all. And you can easily get into a skills formation thing where the initial steps in the skills formation, they were building buildings that were offering training that wasn't the key solution. So no matter how much would have been spent on training and courses and facilities, it would not have been investment. It would have been spend. And so I think the key question for Pakistan and every government is my spend really investment? And that's the capability question. Because if you're not spending with capability, you can spend all you want, and your basically choice is, do I spend on what I know is at least a visible investment like roads, or can I join my investment effort with my capability effort and really turn public investment into investment beyond spend?
Thank you, Lant. Very interesting and a tough question. So I'll conveniently pass it on to Shakil Saab. It's the Jack and the Beanstalk question. Shakil Saab, over to you.
Yeah. Well, that's very interesting. I think that, you know, if one could get one single liner from this whole discussion, that would be this key question of spend versus the actual output. That's for us as you know, planning people, that would be the key for any decision that we make. But before I actually talk about this particular aspect and the question about BRT, a couple of comments on the discussion that took place so far. There was a mention of Punjab Skill Development Fund. We also have allocated some resources this year for creating the same sort of fund in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, because we genuinely feel and we are convinced that it's a very useful investment and it can fetch us some good results. But referring back to my comment that the organizational culture or the preconceived notions that play a very important part. Professor Nabi mentioned the creation of so many Section 42 companies. For me, it was a great initiative and it was pretty appreciated by everyone, Government of Punjab creating those companies. But then you have to see as to what happened to those companies. I mean, there was nothing wrong with the concept. There was nothing wrong with the way they were working. But because at the back end, our laws, our existing mindset, our government structure is such that if you start interpreting those laws and that mindset, that tells you that perhaps, you know, giving these good salaries to a civil servant is not a good idea. So let's get the money back from them. They should work on the same salary, or, you know, spending public monies on such like initiatives, which is partly, you know, quasi private sector, quasi government sector, not a good idea. I mean, I'm not blaming anybody, but the interpretation that we got from the courts, that was something which kind of discourages such kind of innovations. So that's one comment that I wanted to make. On BRT, Hassan, you know the whole story. For me, having now supervising the overall project, I don't see any problem with the design or with the concept. I mean, any large city should have a good public transport system, even if it is subsidized. And we know that, you know, all across the world, perhaps barring Hong Kong, all the public transport systems do rely on subsidies given by the city authorities, municipal authorities, or the state authorities. What went wrong with the BRT again is the decision-making process and the tendency or the urge to get some quick recognition very quickly. When we were inaugurating it, I asked about the actual design period of the whole project. And I was told that its actual completion date as advised by the Asian Development Bank was June 2021. So we still have 9, 10, 11 months for its designed completion period. But somebody said that we could do it in 6 months or 9 months, and the clock started ticking from that day onwards. And come the 6th month or the 9th month, and people started asking questions as to why you didn't complete the BRT. And that put us all on the mat. And we had to cut a very sorry figure for almost 1 year or perhaps more than that. So I think that it's more related to the larger policy making issue rather than something actually wrong with the technical design of the BRT and the manner in which it was designed. Yes, agreed that because of that time period that was given to the authorities to complete it, there were mistakes that they had to commit. They had to commit it because they were told to work day and night and complete a project which was designed for 3 years, but they were asked to complete it in 6 or 9 months. That's the actual problem with the BRT. Now that it has started, about 15 days downwards, the ridership is already touching 130,000 passengers per day. Even when the route buses are still to operate. So I think that it is giving us the results. Lastly, on the spend versus actual output, very interesting because while we were formulating our annual development program for this year, and then when we were conducting our annual review of the last year, this was a question which we posed every department in a different words or different manner. My question to every department was that why do you exist? And once they give me their reasons for existence, I would ask them, have you achieved those reasons? And in many of the cases, it was more of an exercise where they've asked for money, they've spent that money, the spend was there, but the actual output, they failed to give us the actual output. Now, again, 2 reasons for that. At times, there was an output, but since the process or the system doesn't ask them about the output, they didn't have the figures. Good example, our irrigation department. When I asked them that, look, we have given you almost 53 billion rupees in the last 5 years. Now show it to me as to how much more area came under irrigation. And the data that they have, 0. Now that we challenged them, they put a sorry figure in the cabinet. They went back, worked on their statistics, came back to us in a month's time and said, sir, we were wrong. We had done a lot of work. Here is the evidence. We checked the evidence. It was good, verified. They actually added 250,000 acres of land, irrigated land in the last 5 years. So the first thing is that there is output, but since we do not ask this question from the departments, they do not have the data or the baselines to prove that there is an output. Second is, yes, examples are there where we asked the departments, and the cost of unit cost of delivery was so high that that should have compelled the department to change their model or to change their strategy much earlier. But again, since the focus is on spend and not on output, so they were never pushed to change their spending model and focus on the outcome or output. So that's again a very key area. And for me, I mean, working here, I think that this is one of the most important area that I would rather work on in whatever time that I have in the planning and development department, to change the mindset of all these organizations. And in here come the challenge for me, because I have to kind of work with almost 45 different organizations, since I have to take the whole government along with me, and changing the organizational structure or cultures of all the 45 is very difficult. So I have to pick, using my 80-20 formula, and picking 8 or 10 organizations which can actually, give me the results. But the focus would definitely be, in Hassan's project or his program, again, is one program that will be helping us in achieving this goal of shifting from spending to output. Thank you.
Hassan, may I add one thing here? It's interesting to see that KP has brought out a document which is called the Annual Development Plan Policy. And I was really, intrigued to see that, there they have actually written down that there would be no CM's directive and there would be no constituency-based spending at all. So I think the statement of intent is important. And I think it's a commendable step that on the one hand, where you, Shakil Qadir mentioned the second problem of elected leadership coming with their preconceived notions. Here in this document, the provincial government is saying that we will not issue any chief minister, or the chief executive will not issue any directives, and there will be no constituency-based spending. And then, there are clearly, they have, made it clear that they would take a sectoral approach. So I do really hope that this question of moving from how much has been spent to what is the actual investment will be the focus when KP moves from constituency-based spending or departmental-wise allocations to actually, regional spending, sectoral spending, and there would be a move towards assessing and really identifying that what is plaguing the sector, what is the actual problem of the sector, and there a hierarchy of problems could be developed, and then those key problems of all sectors could be focused. My second point was, it's made me, I've been thinking about this a lot, and it's a subject very close to my heart, but I have a puzzle in my mind, and it is about the point Lance made about account-based success stories, that we need to tell the public that here is something which needed to be done, and here is a success story. And of course, I got the impression that a civil servant is telling this story, that this happened. And it's also important for motivation of civil servants, that they have a track record of success with them when they move forward in their careers. But then, coming with the Bavarian concept of faceless civil servant, it somehow doesn't fit well within our, concept of bureaucracy and one or two civil servants being the champions of reform and also projected being as such. So that's a question, I think, so people usually, even if we have in the previous example of Section 42 companies, some very good reform leaders, the bureaucracy is reluctant to give them credit. So there we are.
Hassan, there's one question which was raised by the Additional Chief Secretary, which I think deserves some discussion, which was the question of autonomy, and I think you raised it as well. And how it influences the kind of issues that Land has raised. I really think that the one big credit, well, maybe two big credits that should go to the PPP government. One was the setting up the Benazir Income Support Program. I think it was set up on fantastically strong foundations, and the present government has expanded on it and called it Asas, and it was able to do it because that foundation was very strong. And I think the other very good reform that happened was the 18th Amendment and devolution and giving greater autonomy to the provinces. It was the crying need. It had to be done, and it was great that it got done. And the NFC award that supported it. Now, I do think that it is an unfinished business in two important aspects. One was already raised by Mr. Shakil Durrania on, which was the question of taking it to the next level, from provinces, taking it to local government, decentralizing decision-making further, which is also something that came out of today's discussion. But the other is actually the federal government reimagining its role. We have ministries of education, of health, etc., and they don't know what to do. So they end up talking about having lost too much to the provinces. In fact, they could be of great service to the provinces by improving their ability to monitor how the provinces are doing, by improving their ability to provide new ways of delivering services that the provinces could then adjust to their own needs. So there's a lot of systemic changes that they could bring about and develop the skills to bring those changes about, and then facilitate the provinces to acquire those skills. So they will have to become much more service-oriented than they are right now. The federal government needs to be a much better coordinator across the provinces in order to do justice to the devolution. I think the federal government also needs to be a much better manager of the macroeconomy so that growth doesn't get disrupted every 5 years. So there's a whole lot of agenda that the federal government has to work on in order to make the 18th Amendment and the devolution that came with it to make it work. I do think at the provincial level, much better fiscal management must remain an important issue to focus on, both on the expenditure side for the reasons that Lant has talked about on the investment side, but also on the revenue side. I think there's still a lot more revenue effort that provinces can do to justify the autonomy that they have. There's no, you see, for as long as the provinces remain highly dependent on the federal government for revenues, true autonomy will not be fully possible. I do want to add one quick thing. I found it very frustrating when I was associated with Punjab government that the planning department could not tell the cabinet how much employment was being generated by the public investment programs. Of course, they have to be productive employment, so output first, but then how much employment is generated by that output? Because there was a lot of emphasis on starting new employment schemes without counting the employment that public programs were already generating. So I think we have the opportunity to address this question directly to the ACSKP, that if we were to properly count the employment that's being generated after productive output, I think a lot of this clamor to spend money to create employment will die down. Finally, on roads, in Punjab, same story. Punjab would start its annual budget discussions talking about the social sectors and conclude with more money for roads. And I asked a very senior politician in the PMLN government at the time, I said, why do you guys always end up spending on roads? He said in Tate Punjabi, which I would not use here, he said, Dr. Saab, because we know these guys can build roads, they cannot fix schools. So we don't want to go there. They know how to build roads, and we know how to monitor that they have built roads. So, so yes, I think if we do develop the capacity to address the social sector issues, I think there will be a convergence between the popular perception about what the needs are and what the civil servants say needs to be done. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Shakil sir.
Very quick comment, a couple of comments, Hassan. One, Ms. Saeed mentioned the policy that we recently introduced. Yes, that's a good achievement where the Chief Minister himself agreed that he'll do away with the culture of issuing directives, which somehow weren't covered under any set of rules or laws. And the second one was that, constituency-based schemes, we discouraged it because that again, pointed towards the fact that perhaps, these are conceived without much of planning. But let me tell you, or let me, add that we have not in any manner decided that there will not be any sort of consultation with the elected leadership. That's very important, and that's a key principle. And then to quote Sir Winston Churchill and slightly amending his quote, that public investment is too serious a business to be left to the technocrats and bureaucrats alone. So yes, we have to consult our elected leadership. That's very important for us. The second question, Dr. Ijaz Dhabi's question, very important, sir. Incidentally, I have been asking this question myself, especially in the COVID, related situation. And then different answers actually coming in, but I believe by the end of the day that most of these answers are based on the studies which were conducted elsewhere, case studies coming from the United States or Europe, and telling us that, infrastructure will create this much or social sector will create this much. I think this is a very important area, and we need to study our own public investment management regime and come up with a model or with a calculation of the formula which is unique to our system of investment or the way we invest our monies. So one area where I think that we do not have the answer right now, but an interesting area to work in. Thank you.
Thank you, Shakil sir. At this point, I would also like to ask the participants, because we have been receiving a number of very interesting questions, and we have guests from all over the country and also abroad. So I see a question by Rafiullah Kakar from Balochistan. Can we, Hina, unmute Rafi and give him the mic to ask the question?
Hello, distinguished panelists. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you, Hassan sir, for organizing this wonderful and very insightful panel discussion. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to ask questions from the panelists. So I have basically two sort of questions where I build on my own experiences.
Kakar Saab, if you could kindly introduce yourself to the broader participants. Thank you.
Okay. So my name is Rafi Kakar. I'm currently leading a team that is known as the Strategic Planning and Reform Cell at the Planning and Development Department of Government of Balochistan. I'm not a civil servant. I sort of have been working in the development sector for the last 7 to 8 years, but right now I'm working for the last 3 years. I've been working for the government of Balochistan, primarily working in the P&D department. So we are dealing with public-private partnerships, CPEC, and public investment management reforms. So very relevant to the discussion that was going on here. And I would like to ask questions based on my experiences as a development practitioner sitting in government. So the first question that I would like to ask is, I often sort of believe that the discussions that we have both in our meetings with donor organizations and these kind of sort of intellectual sessions and webinars, I believe that there is excessive focus on the technical dimensions of policy planning and implementation. My experience is that the real challenge governments are facing here is that the interests of the political elites and the bureaucracy are not aligned with the objectives of systemic reforms or with the objectives of improvements in service delivery. And I personally have come to this very, we may call it a pessimistic conclusion, that any major organizational transformation or any major improvement in service delivery is quite unlikely without addressing the political economy constraints or without addressing the political economy around service delivery, with which when the two key players, I believe, are the political elites and the bureaucracy. And I also there are rare success stories here in Balochistan as well. I have studied the companies sort of model implemented by Shehbaz Sharif. I am also aware of the Punjab Skills Development Fund, and I believe some of these were really great initiatives. But again, the caveat is that most often these rare success stories are short-lived. They are either donor-driven or they came into being because of exceptionally motivated or strong political will, and as a result, they are unsustainable. Which brings me back to the question, so what do we do in these circumstances? So one, for the bureaucracy side, maybe civil service reforms is one option, but even for civil service reforms, you need a very strong political government with legitimacy and motivation and power to sort of undertake it. But also, I want to ask, how do we address the incentives and constraints faced by political elites? And I fear that maybe we need to focus more on the demand side of public service delivery rather than on the supply side. So this is my first question. How do we address the opportunities and constraints metrics faced by political elites and civil bureaucracy? The second question, I think very interesting discussion on the spend versus output approach to public investment. And I think ACS, the Honorable ACS from KP, Shakil Saab was very politically correct and kind, and in his sort of remarks, based on the experiences we have had here in government of Balochistan, I think I have come to the conclusion that we should not be very sympathetic to sort of the politicians leading public investment process, because despite the benign intentions, for all practical purposes, it has turned public investment into a disaster. And the real question that Dr. Preche asked about are these investments? I'm afraid more than 90% of these are not investments. Just to give you a few examples from Balochistan. So it's not that we should not consult elected leadership. Yes, they should be consulted. But for all practical purposes, it ends up projects being designed by elected leadership. And trust me, those projects, if I share a few examples from Balochistan with you, it's a very embarrassing story. Most of the projects are individual projects, such as provision of a pipe to some sort of some member in the constituency, construction of water ponds, and many other sort of individual nature schemes that have little relevance to the actual needs of the sector. And I am surprised by the audacity of the planning policy issued by the KP government. It would be very interesting to see the real implementation. Here I want to ask Dr. Saab as to, given the on the ground sort of damaging impact of politicians leading public investment process and the aligned political economy, and they love roads because there is political economy around roads. There are kickbacks starting from award of contract to the actual implementation. You would be surprised to know that half of the non-functional school, the so-called non-functional or ghost schools in Balochistan, are actually newly built schools, which were built by the politicians without due process. So the building is there, but the HR, the soft component doesn't exist. So how do we reform the public in management, given that the politicians do not want to cede control, and also the fact that with them being in charge, the consultation process for all practical purposes ends up in a process where politicians actually design projects and planning department or the concerned departments have little say in it. So with these remarks, I would like to have the opinion of the honorable panelists. And just a disclaimer, these are my personal views. I'm sharing these comments and asking questions in my personal capacity, not as a representative of the government of Balochistan. So you cannot quote me as a representative of government of Balochistan on this. Thank you very much.
Hassan, it's, I think, over to you.
See, I think, Dr. Saab, I got kicked out of the Zoom meeting for about a couple of minutes.
Okay.
When I last dropped out, Rafiullah Kakar was still speaking, but I'm not sure if Land has the opportunity to respond to that. But my intention was to move on to Land for him to kind of respond to some of the points that Rafi raised. Land?
Yes, I think these are very good comments. I was actually working in Balochistan some 10 or so years ago, and all of the issues raised on the ground about the donor-driven and the individual civil service-driven reform being promising but short-lived, and the politician-driven sort of expenditure process being narrowly focused on delivering specific infrastructure resonate for a long time. I do want to emphasize that when we, in the PDIA context, use the word problem-driven, the very first step in what we call the construction of a good problem is avoiding constructing the problem as a technical problem. We want to say, what is a problem around which we can build a coalition that will authorize action? So a key step to the PDIA process is what we call authorization. And authorization is a political process. What is a problem that the organization, the school sector, the police sector, the roads, can generate what we call the AAA of authorization, ability, and acceptance, which is, what is it that the politicians really are going to be sympathetic with and encouraging of the organization to do? What is it that the civil service sees as within its ambit and is willing to do, and at the same time is a sharply perceived problem to be solved around which results are interested from constituents and civil society and the public at large. So the problem construction process in PDIA is precisely a political process. And I just 100% agree that both the civil service and donors in some sense often want to keep a technical process free of those constraints. But once you, to the extent that you free a technical discussion from the actual political economy constraints, it's free to fail. It's free to be a freestanding thing that may or may not succeed as a project, but won't fundamentally in the long run change the capability of the governance and the government sector. So I just fully agree that way too much technical, what is it that technically needs to be done, and way too little, how do you construct a political process that's supportive of what we call, building capability by delivering results. And the results you want to deliver are results that are valued by the politicians, by the civil service, and and acceptable to the organization. So this is why in the PDIA process, the problem construction stage, oftentimes people want to skip the problem. Oh, we know what the problem is. The problem is absenteeism, or the problem is, a lack of tight control over the procurement process. Whereas, oftentimes it takes, if you take 6 months to a year to construct the problem, then you can actually move ahead very fast. Whereas attempting, I think the BTR example is a great example of, let's skip to the results without the process of building the capability. And then, it's the classic thing. Under pressure, the civil service can deliver the type of results that they can deliver, but it doesn't lead to any ongoing transformation. So I think that's a great point. And I think the PDIA process, its first step of problem construction shouldn't be taken as a, let's construct a technical problem. Let's construct a problem around which you actually have authorization from all of the key actors to move ahead. And that process is just explicitly political.
Thank you.
Let me respond to something that Mr. Kakar said. When the politicians in Punjab said, let them build roads because they know how to build roads and we know how to monitor that, they didn't have in mind just the road. They had in mind access to health and education, which was being provided by the private sector. They felt that you give people mobility so that they can go to the schools in the next big town, or they can go to the clinics in the next big town, because everybody has a motorbike now, and all you need is a good road, and that will allow them to do that. So they had in mind the road as a means to access to the services, which is what the constituents still want. They want access to education and health. But the politicians were saying that the public sector education system has not reformed itself despite all the, in fact, it was a coded message to the then chief minister also, because the chief minister was very keen to have school reform, but was not keen to devolve to local decision making. And school reform and primary healthcare reform without a degree of devolution to local monitoring, etc., is very difficult. So the message was both to the politicians as well as a reflection on people's assessment of civil servants' capability to deliver services. I don't know, let's hear it from ACS KP on whether this resonates in KP.
Excuse me. Well, sir, it resonates to a certain level. But coming back to Rafiullah Kakar's viewpoint, I have spent 2 years of my service in Balochistan, and nearly half of that was as a Secretary Planning and Development Balochistan. So I can fully relate to what he said. And it comes back to our initial discussion about the mindset and the priorities of the elected leadership. Unfortunately, in Balochistan, those are presented in not a very good shape. The notions there are very different from what we have in Punjab or Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. I remember when I introduced a procurement process in Balochistan, which is, through tendering and everything, many of the elected members came to me and they said that this process that you've started is very cumbersome. And I said that it is the procurement law, we have to follow that. And he said, and then the reply was that, sir, you are doing something which is illegal. And I said, how is it this is illegal? And they said that the legal thing is to hand over a contract directly to a contractor. That's the legal thing. This is illegal because the culture, or the earlier history of contracting in there was direct contracting. So I agree with Rafiullah's viewpoint and his identification of many problems. But I think that, as the system matures, if there is more transparency in the system, these are some of the issues which are taken care of.
Shahid sir, there is one question specifically for you from Nick Parkhill, who's saying that based on this discussion, what are some of the problems that you would want to focus on, or you would want your department or government to focus on and take a more adaptive approach to solving them?
Well, I think that the few key takeaways for us, and you could call them, the early harvest, the low hangings, or whatever, is this message, this key message, and it gives us a lot of confidence when it comes from a person like Mr. Pritchett, that we should be worrying about this dilemma of spending versus actual output, something which we have embarked upon. But now that it's coming from a very illustrious person, that's something where we'll be working on in the days to come. Definitely, this problem-driven approach is again, it's not that it doesn't come across our thinking, but coming in a structured manner. Based on research, that gives us a lot of confidence to actually focus on the problems and stop thinking about the solutions first. So that's the second bit that we'll be working on. Autonomy is the third one. Again, it happened in a few places in KP, especially the health sector. But, PND might like to drive a couple of other initiatives where we give more autonomies to the organizations at the national or sub-provincial level. So these are the three key areas that we would be focusing on.
Thank you, Shakil sir. At the end, Lant, so I'll ask, although there are a lot of questions that I would have wanted to ask you, but the last question is that the world is facing the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think the way governments are responding to that is a real life PDIA lab, right? So data is coming in, there is a specific problem at hand, and governments are constantly adapting to respond to that challenge. So what are we learning? Has it added to your approach? Is there something that we can take back from this pandemic and to the broader policymaking domain, even after the pandemic? And I think that's going to be the last question, so I'll refer to you.
I think that's a good place to start. Let me start by saying that my career ambition has never been to know anything about COVID, and I think I am living that ambition. I don't actually know anything very specific about COVID, but I do think one of the lasting things that can be useful from COVID is to point out that when there's an actual crisis, governments should look at, how do I act when I'm actually faced with a concrete crisis that I don't know what to do? And the ways in which governments, the reactive governments that are doing well, it's exactly a PDIA process. You authorize action, you try a lot of things, you're focused on the data, you're using feedback loops, you authorize an array of actions that wouldn't have otherwise been possible. And so to some extent, part of what PDIA is saying is, take how you actually are capable of acting when there is a consensus, there's an urgent problem to be solved, and how do we make that the routine way we think about the police? How do we think about the way we make that the routine way we think about skills development? How do we take that same pressured, purpose-driven mobility of action that we can generate in a crisis like COVID and make that work as a more routine way of building capability for delivering results in the routine actions of government? Because it's almost like governments have two mindsets. It's process compliance, business as usual, budgets in, budgets out. As Mr. Khan was pointing out, they often might even have the data on outputs, but don't even feel responsible for sharing it as part of the budget process. How do we use, in some sense, the problem-driven modality that government shifts into to respond to an obvious and shared crisis like COVID, and create that same kind of performance pressure about school performance, about hospital performance, about the police? And I think that'll be the long-term result. I think the long-term positive benefit potentially from COVID is to draw lessons of what did we do when we really had consensus around a problem. You see around the world, governments have been just enormously quicker, more responsive, more data-driven, more feedback loops from even highly what were thought of as capable countries like Europe and the US. Even they found the routine capabilities just weren't enough to address a crisis. So I think in the long run, whatever happens with COVID, I think there are going to be super important lessons about the lessons from responding to an agreed upon problem in the ways of how do we turn that into the kind of routine action that Kakar in Balochistan and Mr. Khan in KP are facing. So I'd conclude with that. Those kinds of lessons I think are going to be important, and they're going to look a lot like PDIA.
Thank you so much, Lant. With that, I think we'll bring our session to the close. I would like to especially thank you for joining us. I would also like to thank our other esteemed panelists, Dr. Ijaz Nabi, Shakil Qadir Khan, Ms. Sara Saeed, our audience, people who joined us from all over the country and around the world. And also, I would like to especially thank IGC and CDPR for organizing such a happening discussion. And Lant, we do hope that after the pandemic is over, we'd be able to have you here and carry on some of these conversations in greater detail. So thank you so much.
I try to come to Pakistan whenever I'm invited. I love working there. I've had great interactions. We just need to wait for the world to solve enough of COVID so that I can get out and I'd love to come to KP. I've never been before. So I would look forward to working with Pakistan. Always love it.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.